This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Special note for listeners, we recorded a short update with Jessica Lee, who made a move to a new professional role since we first recorded this episode. Stay tuned at the end of this episode for an update with Jessica on how she's doing in this new role. Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of When Science Speaks. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter most. We are just so fortunate to have Jessica Lee on the show today. Jessica is an early stage investor at Sonoma Capital, which is a seed stage venture capital firm that invests in firms focused on making a deep, positive societal impact across consumer, enterprise, and healthcare sectors. She previously worked with Morgan Stanley's Global Technology Investment Banking Group in venture with General Catalyst, Romulus Capital, Female Founders Fund, and Global Founders Capital. Jessica is head of content at Alpha, which is an online forum where women in tech talk candidly online for personal and professional support to find jobs and to make friends. She serves as the head curator for the Boston Techstars Startup Digest, mentor at the Alchemist Accelerator, direct content, and also she's on the global board for Harvard in Tech, among writing and organizing roles at related startup-focused organizations. Jessica also is currently an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Alumni Entrepreneurs, where she meets regularly with founders. Jessica earned her bachelor's in economics, applied math, and computer science from Harvard University, high honors, and a summa honors thesis. Welcome to the show, Jessica. It's fantastic to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Now, the beginning of this is a bit of a meta experience in the sense that you are yourself a very experienced and insightful interviewer, and we're going to include one of the links in the show notes will be your over 100 interviews with startup founders, just as one example of all the interviewing that you have done. And from your perspective, when you are asking the questions, what are key elements to your approach to interviewing? And maybe how do they inform your approach when potential portfolio companies are pitching to you and your colleagues at Sonoma Capital?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for the kind words and for asking. So I think there's a few different elements. So the first, I think, is really identifying somebody's superpower. I think there's this misconception of sorts that we can only or mostly only learn from people like Jeff Weiner or Bill Gates or Larry Page, et cetera. And obviously we can learn a ton from them, but I actually feel like in many, if not most instances, we can learn more from people who are a little bit more adjacent to us in their
Mhm.
career trajectory or company building journey or whatever it might be, because, well, I guess a few different reasons. First is that for, let's just take Bill Gates as an example. So many years ago that he built Microsoft, even though it obviously is a tremendous achievement, but it's just been so long that,
Mhm.
no one would fault him for not remembering all the details. And then obviously he's so high profile that anything he says is really scrutinized. And so he's probably a little bit more focused on PR and all those things, and will always just kind of provide a more vague response than not. And then
Mhm.
finally, even if he remembers exactly everything he did right and wrong, it's a very different time back then than it is now, especially with the rapid macro and micro developments in every sense of the word. And so I actually feel like there's a lot of value in identifying people, maybe not everyday people in the very traditional sense, but relatively everyday people who have a unique superpower. So for example, just to provide something a little bit more concrete, I spoke with this founder a few months back, which is still one of my favorite interviews. It's Jillian Julian Morris, who's a solo founder and the CEO of this travel tech company called Hitlist, which is
Mm-hmm.
obviously a really interesting story during COVID, given obviously all the headwinds to travel, but perhaps even the more interesting and more long-standing and long-term relevant part of the story is that she's a solo, non-technical female founder, and so
Mm-hmm.
there's all these natural challenges that she's facing, and so even though she's no Bill Gates or whatever, and it's still TBD what will happen to her company long term, just like it is with any startup, her superpower really is in being a solo non-technical female founder and overcoming those really unique challenges that are perhaps extra difficult but also actually more common than we might think
Mm-hmm.
in the founder world. And so it was really about speaking with her briefly before and reading over her background to obviously just let her know what I'm doing, and then also more importantly really get a sense of what she would most like to share based on her experiences. And she doesn't have to obviously tell me her superpower. It's actually more interesting and more relevant if I kind of dig it out myself. And in
Mm-hmm.
this case it was a little bit more obvious than usual, just given her structural challenges that she faced in building Hitlist, but it was still really interesting to better understand her journey and where I felt like she would have the most unique insights to share. And so after kind of that initial conversation, I type up some questions for her to marinate on.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't have to type it out or anything crazy like that. But I think even just in the process of thinking, and kind of similar to for me in this interview, obviously none of these questions are rocket science or require like, me to study something or,
Mm-hmm.
read a separate book or something. It's all based on my experiences, but it's still super valuable for me to more intentionally reflect on them, because that's
Mm-hmm.
not something that we do all the time every day. And so it's helpful for her and all the past interviewees to marinate on that and really kind of have it in the back of their mind and sort of noodle on it, if you will. And then when we did talk, it's really helpful to be able to dive more into that. So I think that's been pretty interesting, and that's been something that's really informed my approach in venture as
Mm-hmm.
well, maybe in sort of a different way, since with venture, especially in the early stage. So I focus on seed stage, have done some Series A and some pre-seed, but all really in the early side of things, definitely not the growth or private equity realms. And so I think what's really interesting there, somewhat similar and maybe some differences as well relative to interviewing Jillian or others like that for Alpha and other content pieces, is that I think something that a lot of investors focus too much on in the early stage is the numbers. And they'll focus so much on, is this number 62 or 63? And if it's 63, it's super different from, in the case if it were 62 or even,
Uh-huh.
some numbers that are farther apart, 60
Right.
and 70. But I think it's really about the people. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think the main lesson learned is just how to really understand people at their core and how to understand their core competencies. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously everybody has that, but it's sort of a matter of whether the core competencies in the case of venture and the founders, there's multiple founders and multiple people on the leadership team, which there usually is, if it's really complementary and if
Mm-hmm.
they mesh well together and if they're the right fit for this particular market and particular problem. And even just to be a founder in the first place, because obviously not every single person in the world, and frankly not even most people, are built to be founders. And so that's been really helpful as well, just really drilling down to who people are at their core. With venture, it's a little bit more personal and less sort of skill based. Obviously skill is a huge part of that, but it's a little bit more multifaceted venture, just given building a company and making kind of a substantial investment is sort of a higher stake situation than
Mm-hmm.
interviewing someone, but
Mm-hmm.
still kind of that similar idea of really understanding a person at their core.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So helpful. And now thinking about it from the other perspective, say from the founder's perspective, in translating what they do, because now they're going to have, and the example you gave actually is really salient too, because you're talking about a non-technical founder. And so in translating what they do, what their product is, what their service is, and why, the market needs that, what do many founders really get wrong? Maybe even including the recognition that there has to be a translation that is is required. A lot of times, scientists that I'm talking to, it's almost like, well, the data speaks for itself.
Yeah.
The science is clear. But now, as you suggest, you're in a different environment. The stakes are much higher. People are investing, and it's not the same. So thinking about maybe what the founder, should be doing or emphasizing in those meetings with you and colleagues.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And I actually think about this a lot. So, and this might segue into later conversations here, but my little brother, he's in high school right now, is a senior in high school.
Hmm.
It's just crazy to think, but he does a lot of science fairs, and he is IQ wise and technically like leaps and bounds smarter than myself. I remember in college when I took some grad level math classes, which were super challenging for me, and I'm sure the average student in my class as well. He was actually helping me, even though he's 6 years younger. And so
Yeah.
he's super, super brilliant, to say the least. But I found that actually for many years, he was doing wonderful science research projects, actually a little bit more math, but in any case, sort of STEM more broadly. And he was going to conferences and competitions and presenting them to judges. And obviously, as the audience here knows, all of these research projects are in a very specific area. And so, you kind of become an expert in that specific area just through the process of your educational journey and specifically the process of doing this project. But, the judges kind of come from all walks of life, which
Hmm.
is great. But odds are they probably aren't also a specialist in the exact same area. And so I found that he wasn't doing super well in these science fairs, the ones where he had to actually present and articulate something, usually verbally, sometimes in a written form as
Hmm.
well. And so I was wondered because, and was trying to more actively help him to sort of turn around those results as well, since I really felt that he deserved, a better outcome, just given how wonderful his project was. And I definitely wasn't an expert on his project. It was sort of, a little bit above my understanding of the field. But I think one thing that really helped me, and I looked back to my own science fair experiences many years ago now. But I think one thing that really helped me is, so for example, I did this research project that was a little bit more applied math, computer science, nothing sort of really in the lab, but kind of same idea. Is pretty technical, broadly speaking, and it was on cellular automata to model snowflakes. I guess that's kind of a cool thing because sort of out of the box, but
Right.
people are kind
Right.
of like, oh, cool, snowflakes, like that's, fun for cocktail parties, but what relevance does this have to the real world? How are you actually going to do anything meaningful with this?
Mhm.
Why should we give you an award
Right.
or any recognition? And so I think one thing that I really hammered home and made sure I always had a slide on, or in many cases, multiple slides on, was the application. And so I
Mhm.
talked about different possible applications to material science and engineering and designing better firefighter suits and different applications to even modeling neurons in
Mhm.
patients with ALS and
Mm.
other diseases that affect the neurons. And so I think it's really important to get a broader audience really excited. If it is, obviously, if it is just like your professor or something, that's very different. But if
Mhm.
it is like venture capitalists who probably aren't experts on those fields, or even potential partners who are a little bit more experts than venture capitalists, but still probably pretty broad in their own training and their own interests, it's really helpful to get people excited about the broad applications.
Mhm.
Like even though, I guess in my case, my grandfather did have ALS, but for most people, hopefully, thankfully, they aren't affected in any way by ALS, but they
Mhm.
still know it's a huge problem. And same with firefighters, I guess, especially these days, very top of mind. But I think it's sort of finding something that everybody really cares about and kind of strikes an emotional chord with people
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
some ways. And so I think that's super helpful as well. And then I think also, it's really helpful too to have someone who has no experience in the field listen in on your pitch. I think for my brother, for example, he is pretty close with my dad, who's like also kind of a very similar mind and like probably understands everything that he's saying, and really cares about the technical stuff. But something that I did was always talk to my mom, who's a wonderful person but just not as technical and not really deeply in the weeds of any of this stuff. And so
Mhm.
she was really able to see my logical gaps. I think sometimes people have an instinctive aversion to speaking with people who don't quote unquote naturally get it, or like aren't in the field. They're like, oh, why would this be useful? But I think it's actually in many cases more useful when perfecting your pitch, probably not when you're actually doing the thing, but at least when you're communicating
Mhm.
it. And I think you get much more relevant feedback in that. And so I think that's really, really important as well. And I think the final thing I'll say is whenever I speak to founders who, more specifically, so not just sort of in the general communication sphere, but specifically with founders, I think it's really important to, again, sell that big vision and sell that big idea and not get too caught up in the weeds of like, first I did this and here's all the very
Yeah. Yeah.
nuance intricacies. I think the other
Yeah.
thing too is show that you have a very clear understanding of the challenges, as well as the steps you'll take to ameliorate, or
Mm-hmm.
overcome those
Mm-hmm.
challenges in the path to commercialization. I think sometimes founders, you obviously want to put your best foot forward in pitches and paint a really optimistic view, but I think there's a difference between being realistic and being or balance between being realistic and being optimistic. Like optimistic, or good optimism is like selling that big vision and like this can impact firefighters or ALS patients in my example. But then being realistic is saying like, I've had founders who said, oh, we'll be in 30,000 whatever units,
Yeah.
whether it's providers or practices,
Sure.
within like 6 months or something, and maybe they'll do it, but odds are not terribly good. And so I think kind of being really realistic, even if it doesn't paint you in like the ideal light, I think that actually makes people believe you more and
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
that you have a deeper understanding of what next steps are
Mm-hmm.
outside of the science itself.
Mm-hmm. I just love that. There are a few things that you said, Jessica, that really resonate. Actually, that are consistent with what I teach when I'm talking to PhDs and postdocs about how to communicate their science effectively to any audience. Is first of all the emotion aspect, but it starts sort of like, why should I care? The big question, why should I care about the snowflake? Well, if you had
Yeah.
ALS, or you know someone, or you're a firefighter, or you have you realize the importance of these people in society, yeah, you care a lot, and it's so relatable. You can see this person, you can really put your fingers on it, where mentally, where if you're talking about theoretical topics, what's the brain kind of thinking about, the non-expert kind of thinking about in his or her mind as you're talking? It's like there's nothing to grab onto, there's nothing that's relatable. And then the emotion, and that sort of comes along with the emotional aspect of it. Being specific does generate emotions, and people make decisions based on emotions as well as data, of course.
Um,
And then the credibility of the speaker, if it's like this rosy-eyed pie in the sky, as you described,
yeah.
discussion. One
Mhm.
thing that I hadn't really thought about, but you raised it, and I just wanted to get your take
Yeah.
on that too. With respect to the challenges, I completely agree. I mean, the person has to be realistic. I think also, just from like a narrative standpoint, like, we have this great idea, but there's this challenge. I mean, that fits the that fits the
Yeah.
storytelling schema that we're really comfortable and we like to see things within. And so in some ways, yeah, you have to show your authenticity, your understanding that this isn't going to be easy. But the other benefit, I guess I would say, and I hadn't thought about this until your response, was that it actually fits very nicely into the you know uh, thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of thing that we like to understand things that are new, particularly when it comes to things that are new, for example.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
um, you have both aspects. You have a strong background in quantitative skills. um, I always talk that I'm the underachiever in my family because my sister was valedictorian and went to Yale. But she has her strengths and I have mine, just like you and your brother. But in addition to this strong background that you have on the quantitative side, you're also a frequent writer and speaker and interviewer. And the combination, as I've found, as I've had an opportunity to interact with so many great, interesting people doing high impact things, the combination of these two abilities at such a high caliber is really unusual. And I'm wondering how you feel, sort of your dual talents developed. And then maybe even in thinking about when you're writing and when you're working on a really hard math or you know CS problem or something like that, computer science problem, like, are there any kind of connections in the way you think?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the kind words. I guess just to give a little bit more of a personal context. So, I think this is super interesting and something that I've thought a lot about as well, because growing up in high school and in college, especially in high school where, every single class was kind of mandatory, or at least subject, always didn't actually really enjoy English class. And it was sort of well known, I guess, at least among my family and friends, that it wasn't my favorite subject. And then these days, obviously, I've been writing a lot. And so people, when I catch up with them, they're like, oh, this is super cool, but I never knew you enjoyed writing. And like you're never a fan of, writing essays in English class. And so I thought about it because I felt like it was a interesting kind of contrast or juxtaposition. And I realized that in English class, at least the ones that I attended in college and in high school, maybe, most kind of academia world, things are very theoretical, and you sort of talk about things at this very high level of abstraction,
Mhm.
and you write for your teacher or for your classmates or for the ivory tower, or whatever you want to call it, which has a place as well, a place and a time. But I think for me, I never really enjoyed that. It just wasn't sort of my own personal interest or
Mhm.
priority. And I think now when I'm writing, it's actually more just to be able to, as you alluded to, communicate and connect with and get information across to a very broad audience,
Mhm.
including many, if not most, people who are not, anywhere near the ivory tower. And I think actually that goes back to a lot of my childhood. So I was born in the States, but went back to China to stay with my family, extended family there, like aunts, uncles, grandparents,
Mhm.
in different parts of China until pretty later on in life, and came back during elementary school,
Mhm.
which is, sounds early, but you kind of learn a lot of language in those early years, pre-elementary school or early
Mhm.
elementary school. And this was back in the early days. My parents were just moving to New Jersey, and so I came back when they had found jobs because they were students when I was just born, and so long story short, they weren't able to raise me, and so
Mhm.
they finished their PhDs, which can, as audience knows, take a long time.
Right.
They both actually got two, and so that took extra long. And
Mhm.
they finally found a job in New Jersey, and so I came back from China to stay with them. But it was already very late in my life, and I obviously wasn't learning too much English in China. I don't know if I
Right.
actually learned any that I retained. And so I came here and needed to learn English, obviously, to be able to survive, not just communicate with friends and neighbors and classmates and teachers, but actually to help my parents as well.
Mhm.
Because while I had probably missed some part of the language learning window that people talk about, they had totally missed it
Mhm.
because they came here when they were in their late 20s or mid
Right.
20s, which is obviously super late. And so they speak English, and can read it, and all those good things, but not super super well, and definitely not so well. I guess now it's been over a decade ago. And so I actually had to help my mom, for example, even like small things that built up, like ask the cashier about where things are in the grocery
Mhm.
store, like fill out taxes, or like if we needed like to borrow something from our neighbors, like, would ask them as well. And then my mom actually, she wanted me to be very daring early on. And so she encouraged me to do even just odd jobs for our neighbors, like raking leaves or shoveling
Mhm.
snow or things like that, which initially I was kind of like resentful for because I'm a little bit introverted as a person, and especially when I didn't really know the language. But in hindsight, I really like that she forced me to do those things, and my dad to an extent as well. And so I think over time, I learned to use communication as kind of a way to, not to be, overly dramatic, but kind of a way to survive
Mhm.
in some ways, or just for some purpose it's a little bit more immediately actionable and immediately tangible with a little bit higher stakes than perhaps
Right.
something that's at a super high level of abstraction. And so I think that sort of carried over, sort of, I guess, was dormant during high school and during college to an extent when I was, mostly grinding on those papers, but then sort of came back to me since then in the past couple of years as I've been writing more. And so I think that's actually been really interesting and sort of maybe not a true curse, that sounds dramatic again, but one of those challenges that turns out to be a blessing. And so
Mhm.
I always really, really appreciated that. And I think the other thing too, so that was a little bit more on my mom and on my dad. So he was a little bit less, I guess, pushing or pushy on that front, but he also taught me a lot as well about this distinction between value creation and value capture. He was an engineer his whole life by training and now in his job. And, it's definitely a great job, but he always realized that, you could create the best product, which is totally in your hand as a great engineer, I guess these days, also product managers, et cetera. But that product, will never see the light of day or have revenue or have any sort of material impact if you don't have the right branding and marketing and
Mhm.
communication and partnerships and relationships and distribution channels and all of that, still challenging and partially IQ, but a lot of the EQ stuff as well. And
Yeah.
so he always pushed me to think a lot about this distinction and hopefully be able to be at the intersection of the two. And so that's always been really top of mind as I've gone through my own development as well. And so I think that's been really, really helpful too. And so I think that's sort of more on like the writing side and how I was able to develop that. I think, kind of thinking about challenges that require, maybe less so writing and more so more of a research problem. I think actually one thing that I learned a lot from actually Shashir, who's the one one of the co-founders and I'm now CEO of Coda, which is the document company. And he had a great tech career before, I think, with Microsoft, Google, and YouTube, and different sort of engineering and product roles. And one thing he always talks about, so he's a founder in our portfolio, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him a few weeks back as
Mm-hmm.
well. One thing he always talks about is this concept of an eigen question, or kind of framing questions like that. So instead of kind of getting super in the weeds of like, should we like, the example he gave was from his YouTube days of whether YouTube, maybe I'm getting the details wrong, but it's basically whether YouTube should link to search results that are not native to YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
back in the early days. And people were like, no, I think we should. And other people were like, no, we definitely shouldn't. And I think the way in which he framed it, I forget if he was like a product leader or manager at the time, probably something like that. But the way in which he framed it was sort of less of like, should we or shouldn't we, but more around, would we rather build our own brand or have more comprehensive search results? And he says it a lot better than I do, but I think it's more about framing things at the very fundamental level.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very innovative and very elegant, but elegant in the sense that it's very challenging to come up with. You do need to, think deeply about it. It's no walk in the park, but elegant also in that anybody can really understand it and you really kind of get to the heart of the problem. And I think that's really relevant in the quantitative and complexity sphere as well as in writing. And so I think that's been another interesting intersection and a framework I've used to solve certainly technical problems. And I guess sort of in recent times also moved it to more of the writing training as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm. Wow, really, really interesting that and thanks for sharing those specific stories
Yeah.
because they really do illuminate, how these different aspects of your approach were formed at a really young age.
Yeah.
So fascinating. So, in addition to your mentoring of founders that, I mentioned in the introduction, you also are head of content at Alpha, which you alluded to. This is this online forum for women in tech. And I'm wondering if there are specific obstacles that women in particular in tech encounter that are not experienced by their male counterparts. I think you sort of answered that question already when you gave that example earlier on. And maybe the more salient question really in this sense is how can men in the industry support their female colleagues who may be facing these challenges?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking. I think to add a little bit more to the first questions on the specific challenges, I'd
Mm-hmm.
say there's two. One that's a little bit more, or at least two main ones. One that is a little bit more specific to founders, and the other one that's a little bit broader. So they're kind of related as well. But to founders, I think I forget who coined this phrase, but I really think it's just so top of mind for me. And actually, one of the reasons I decided to go into venture and hope to be in it a little bit long term as well. It's the idea that women pitch businesses and men pitch unicorns. Obviously, it is a stereotype and generalization. It's not, every single situation, but I think high level, it is sort of true or leans true. And basically, the idea there is that women go into pitch meetings, and it's usually just given the stats in venture capital and who's GP and who has check writing
Mm-hmm.
ability. It's usually men at the other side of the table, and they could be very well-meaning people, no malice, no malicious intent, but the woman or two women pitching might feel naturally, not really confident just because the people on the other side of the table don't seem very relatable for
Mm-hmm.
obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And so
Mm-hmm.
they feel like they need to be armed with numbers and data and research and all the details about the supply chain and the warehouse and all the financial models, et cetera,
Right.
for their business, which is obviously really important to actually running a business, but not the, I guess, most exciting thing for most people, and especially VCs who love just thinking about the big vision and the dreams.
Right.
That's the whole
Mm-hmm.
point of probably why they went into VC in the first place. And then conversely, men feel more confident and more empowered when they're going into these meetings because they do see people a little bit more similar to themselves at the other side of the table. And so they feel more confident pitching just that, 5, 7, 10-year vision
Mm-hmm.
without going into too much of the weeds of actually running the business, whether or not they have that prepared in appendix. But in the pitch itself, they really focus on this long-term vision. And so I think that's super interesting and, partially leads to a lot of the funding disparities between women and men. And I think broadly, both founders and non-founders, we've always heard that women find it challenging to speak up in the workplace, whether literally in a meeting or just in general sharing their ideas, even if they have great ideas. And I think one thing that has actually been really helpful for me is sort of validating or verifying my ideas in some ways,
Hmm.
so that I feel personally more confident,
Hmm.
and can present these ideas in a meeting or in a one-on-one or email or whatever to the rest of my team or my boss or other leaders in the company, and not have my heart racing and be like, oh, what if it's wrong and totally stupid, but I actually have more data to back it up if they
Hmm.
do dive into that.
Hmm.
And so I think that's really helpful, as well, more from what women can do to help each other, help themselves. But in terms of the second part of your question on how men can be great allies, in the industry, I think a couple of different things. I think first is even just like noticing, I guess, for male investors, even just noticing kind of the biases
Yeah.
that they have. So I don't think most cases, if not the large majority or all of them, I don't think it's like intentionally malicious, but I think you just have or people just have certain instincts.
Hmm.
And a lot of it is very societal and very systemic and difficult to change kind of overnight. But I think even just taking a pause very intentionally and realizing where your biases might be when you're formulating an opinion about a pitch or saying something or having a reaction, or having a thought, I think that's really, really important. I think the second thing too, is to basically really internalize too in the pitch front. I think a lot of times, obviously, women are creating products, or platforms or services for other women, but men sort of say like, oh, just think of my wife or my daughters, and they probably wouldn't use this, which is perhaps true, but their wife or daughters might not be everybody. And so I think
Right.
being a little bit more scientific about evaluating products and services in the venture context that women are creating, and really internalizing that. I mean, obviously, we all know women are half the population, but I think kind of really internalizing that in a more scientific and more granular way is really helpful. And I'd say kind of more broadly as well, not just in venture and in funding, but more broadly, I think what's really helpful too is, for example, if a woman raises her hand in a meeting, kind of prioritize calling on her. If obviously, if all the women in the company have been very vocal, that might be a different thing. You might have a very positive culture. But if this is like one of the first women who've spoken out or something, I think it's kind of really important to be able to give them the opportunity and the platform and the encouragement and the support to speak up and sort of have this model as well for other women who might want to do the same, in a value-added way down the line,
Hmm.
as well. And so I think that's super important. I think the second thing too is a lot of times, I see these like women's, whether it's like an employee resource group or whatever they call them, internally, or sometimes there's external organizations, and it's all women helping women, which is really great, as well. And there's a ton of value in that, and that definitely should not be eliminated. But I think it's helpful to kind of have more men involved in these organizations as well. Obviously, to the extent that they're comfortable and the organization is open to it, but kind of having more of at least an offer to be a support, there. Because I think a lot of times when it is just women supporting women, they kind of just stay in their own circles,
Hmm.
and it doesn't sort of solve that systemic kind of network problem. And so I think that's super helpful as well.
Mhm. Thank you for being so specific. Really, really helpful. You've achieved quite a lot, and I actually didn't even mention because this was late breaking news about your designation recently in Boston, being one of the top entrepreneurs. I may be mangling this a little bit, so correct me, Jessica, if I do. This is really just kind of came together last night, I think, or
Yeah.
released this week
Yeah.
about this great designation of being one of the top entrepreneurs in your age group, which is absolutely fantastic. And so you've achieved so much already in your career journey, and you're kind of like just getting started.
Sure.
What qualities, if you kind of had to look reflectively and think about, like, what qualities that you have do you think have been particularly useful in spurring your successes just so far?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking, for the kind words as well. So I think the number one thing is sort of having this, I think, kind of healthy level of obsession with organization,
Mhm.
and, perhaps like paranoia and, not like a bad way, but just sort of like kind of what the former Intel CEO had mentioned around, the importance or the relevance of paranoia in leadership and in
Mhm.
building an organization. And so I think for me, even just like micro things that I think add up over time,
Mhm.
of making sure I block out every half hour of my day for a very actionable task. Obviously, a call is a call, but for all those hours in between, in the morning, in the evening, on the weekends, etc., where there isn't a call, making sure that I really am able to do all the internal work that I need to do, whether it's something more active like writing or something a little bit more passive but still important like reading or thinking, and basically kind of having these micro level goals
Mhm.
that really match up and add up together to be my weekly, monthly, annual life, et cetera, goals. And so I
Mhm.
think that's perhaps really helpful, this sort of like obsession with organization, also really organized about my inbox as well, and like communications with people, which I think, sounds like a small thing as well, but I think it really adds up in terms of the relationships you build and constantly being supportive and
Mhm.
responsive to people. So I think that's really helpful. I think the second thing is even just maybe something that I learned from my parents, or maybe I don't know if it's something that's very broad in Chinese culture, and also just from some books that I read over time, like Give and Take in particular by Adam Grant. Obviously, is a very famous psychologist, as I think you pen. It was like this idea of give first, not
Mhm.
just give emptily and be kind of like a sad giving tree or something, or nonprofit forever or something. Although obviously nonprofits are great, but I think it's this idea of give first, so that you always add value to every interaction and every
Mhm.
relationship that you have, and eventually, and this shouldn't be like a goal or anything transactional or
Mhm.
anything. Very specific and very kind of, maybe not malicious is the right word, but very, deal oriented,
Mhm.
like that. But you eventually kind of hope to have this network that has a ton of value and doesn't have to, give you value in terms of jobs or something super concrete like that. That might also happen, which is cool. But, more often than not, it's just generally this reputation that
Mhm.
you have, and interesting conversations you're able to have, and people you're able to lean on for support, and they're able to lean on you, and even just kind of happiness in general in terms of being kind to other people. And so I think kind of this mentality of give first has been really important to me, as well. And then I think the final thing that I've only realized recently, and I wish I had learned earlier, is that there really isn't an idea of disappointing other people. Obviously, the micro level, there could be, if your boss tells you to do something and you don't, then they're probably going to be disappointed, and that's not good. But I think in the macro level of like life decisions,
Mhm.
obviously outside of like horrible life decisions, but more in the context of like what industry you work in or what company you work in or what your title is. Because I think for a long time, it's really interesting. They have this sort of theory that people think theoretically people go to Harvard or schools like that to be able to de-risk themselves. It's meant to be this place where, if you graduate, as most people do, even if something awful happens on the line in your career, you can look back or point back to the fact that you graduated from this institution, and people know that you're a certain sort of baseline of smart. So it should actually de-risk you enough to empower you and enable you
Mhm.
to take more risks. And I'm not saying, like crazy risks, like put all your money into, some random thing, but even just risks in terms of like doing something that's not mainstream,
Mhm.
which doesn't sound dramatic, but might seem like a risk for some people or most people. And so I think what actually happens though is that people who go to Harvard, including myself for a brief period of time, get sort of addicted to de-risking themselves. They're like, oh, I went to Harvard. Now what's the next thing? Oh, it's banking. Oh, it's Goldman Sachs. Okay, now I'm done with that. What's the next thing? Okay, it's business school. Let me go to GSB or
Mhm.
with Stanford, or HBS with Harvard, or Sloan with MIT. And then okay, cool, did that. What's next? Okay, it's private equity. And obviously, if you genuinely love all those things, that's awesome. But I guess most people probably don't, who do that probably don't, love banking or love private equity so much. And so I think it's really important to kind of break yourself, definitely de-risk yourself to the extent possible, because that's important to have. But definitely kind of, if you do, break yourself out of that loop of de-risking yourselves and think less about climbing a ladder to nowhere in society and more about kind of what it is you personally want to do.
All
Because
right.
sure, like maybe I've had mentors, formal and informal, as well as just, other kind people advise advised me on different decisions I made in my career, whether it was quitting banking back in the day to go into venture or, something else. And everybody kind of has their own 2 cents. Like if you talk to 50 people about your decision, probably in most cases, unless it's very egregious, no, all 50 people will not agree on the same thing, and you have to choose something that some people in that pool of people you've talked to don't agree with. And I think people have this pressure of like, oh, will I disappoint my parents or my
Mm-hmm.
friends or people who were so kind to offer me their time and their advice. And I think obviously people might be shocked, or they might disagree, or they might be surprised with your decision, but ultimately there is no person to disappoint except for yourself. And so I think it's really about listening to you and what it is you want to do. And I think kind of having this clear mind and sort of internal sense of self-worth is really, really important. So I'd say those are kind of the main things that I've really been grateful for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, there are risks associated with, following something that you think society or other important stakeholders in your life want you to do, but your heart's not in. There's a lot of risk associated with that, personal risk, being unhappy and all that
Exactly.
what follows from there. As we wrap up, Jessica, I want to ask, many listeners are interested in getting involved in the startup ecosystem in one way or another, maybe as a founder, perhaps. Of course, not everyone is built for that, as you said earlier, or maybe as a member of a startup team. What advice do you have for listeners who may be scientists or engineers thinking about entrepreneurship as a career choice?
Yeah, I'll talk about two things. One is sort of like training more internally, and the other one is sort of more maybe tangible or tactical in terms of, getting in the door. But I think training kind of in terms of more internal or skill-based training,
Hmm.
one thing that I think is super important is a lot of times in the transition from doing to leading, and I think this applies in the transition from research or something deeply technical to business, is that when you're doing or when you're just working on a research project, you're really focused on the micro of what you've been assigned by your professor, or by, in some cases, your boss, or whatever, and you really focus on doing that, and you could do it super, super well and on time and all these good things. But in order to be able to one day, and hopefully the not too distant future, lead some type of team and hopefully ascend as well, from there you really have to understand the context, and even just to be considered for these leadership roles and be associated subconsciously, consciously by people who make decisions around promotions or job
Hmm.
opportunities, to show that you're not just an executor. Obviously that is kind of the minimum, and so it's good to do that, but you have to show that you understand the context and you're able to actually add value, not just through your hands and your time, but also through your creativity in terms of providing guidance or adding ideas to how this can be done or how this can be done better, and not just kind of following exactly what your boss or other higher ranking quote unquote person
Hmm.
dictates.
Hmm.
And obviously, sometimes your boss might say, oh, that's a great idea, but actually, here are the reasons why it wouldn't work, or we actually tried that, but thank you so
Yeah.
much for
Hmm.
proposing that. But it's always going to be a positive, and obviously, in the upside case, you're like, wow, that's actually great. Let's run with it. And
Yeah.
so, I think it's really helpful to understand the context of why you're doing something and what something is meant to teach you. This is something that at a very micro level, my dad always kind of ingrained in me growing up of like, okay, you're doing this math problem, but like, what is it actually quizzing you? And I think that even goes back to the sort of eigen question, thing that Shashira at Coda has mentioned of like, don't just look at the surface level of the task. Definitely, understand that as well, but also
Yeah.
dive deeper into what
Hmm.
it's meant to do and how it
Hmm.
fits into the broader
Hmm.
machine, and
Hmm. Hmm.
works with other departments and other moving pieces to paint the larger picture. And so I think really thinking critically about that. And sometimes it isn't just thinking, it involves asking your boss, or asking other team members, or getting to know people cross functionally. I think that's super important, and really kind of helps you develop those skills and critical thinking skills, not just execution skills. And so
Hmm.
I think that's the part on internal training. The part on getting your foot in the door, I think what's really helpful actually in my life, I've cold emailed so many people, and obviously so many people have not responded, which is totally fine as well. But actually, a lot of people have, and it's led to really, really great things, including a lot of startup jobs that I've gotten as even as a younger person. And so I think it's really helpful to write very effective cold emails. I'm sure we've all received cold emails or like, hey, like, can you chat? And there's like literally no context and
Right.
like very obvious,
Yeah.
overlap and like their
Right.
background, even if they have a great background, but there's no obvious overlap. And,
Hmm.
obviously always happy to help, but we all have only, 24 hours of the day. And
Hmm.
that we're sleeping and the other part we're largely working or with family. And so I think it's really helpful to show you're kind of in even the give first vein of like showing your value up front of like in the past I've even like reached out to and obviously it's a little bit more difficult if you're reaching out to like the CEO or founder of like a massive public company, but in the case of seed stage or even series A or pre-seed or early stage startups, which there obviously are a lot of, these founders are usually super close to the product and still kind of figuring it out and iterating. And they love talking
Hmm.
to users of the product. They love talking to people who are passionate about it, just like them, and have feedback and ideas. And so something I've done in the past is just even reach out to founders of products that I love. Sometimes I'm a user, sometimes I've just heard really great things or just admire what they're doing and share some of my ideas for whether it's the product itself or whether it's more strategic growth things like different partnerships they could create and different things at a very tactical level, not just like, oh, you should get more customers or something
Right.
very kind of
Yeah.
high hand wavy like that. But, here's how, or here's how I think you could.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I think that's really valuable as well. And so I think writing these really effective cold emails with a lot of meat in that respect. And I think also a personal touch. I think a lot of times people just blast out the same email to everybody. And you might not be doing that, but people are a little bit jaded, I guess,
Hmm.
these days, especially kind of founders or, recruiting folks. And so I think it's really helpful to show that you took the time to really understand them. One thing that I don't advertise too much, at least in my professional life, but have sort of a small line on it on my LinkedIn is that I'm a huge fan of running. And I guess it's also my Twitter bio, but it's not, like I'm not like a, marathon runner, like Olympic person or whatever. So it's not, loud and upfront in everything that I do, but it's sort of like a small, like fun fact, I guess you could say, about me. And whenever people mention that in their cold emails, like, oh, I saw you're a runner. You don't have to be a runner yourself. You could just say that you noticed that and that's cool, or like you used to run, or your sister runs, or whatever. But even just showing that you took the time to know that about me is super, I think, just super touching. Or even like nuanced facts. I guess it's a little bit less cold outreach, but so I'm in New Jersey right now, quarantining with my family, which is a little bit kind of like a not like truly random, but it's not New York and it's not SF and it's not Boston or kind of all the places that you would assume person working in tech would be. But whenever somebody I catch up with, even like months later since our last conversation, our last live conversation, whenever they remember that I'm in New Jersey, I'm like, wow, that's actually, it sounds like a small, small thing and it's not rocket science, but I think even just like remembering people and adding that personal touch
Hmm.
is super, super valuable. And so
Yep.
I'd say in terms of, cold route, obviously going in network if you can, and, warm intros and requesting those. But if you can't, then, writing these personal touch as well as give first and value added messages, especially to early stage founders or other leaders in perhaps larger organizations.
Such specific and important information, really actionable information for listeners. So thank you for sharing that, Jessica. Some of the things that you said that really struck a chord with me was this, first of all, this sort of difference between output and outcome, right? It's when you started to talk about that a little bit, I was immediately thinking about some of the messages that your dad had conveyed to you when you were growing up, like, okay, this might be the actual thing that happens when we go from A to B, but like higher level, like what do we actually want from this entire experience? Which sounds a bit like the YouTube example that you gave too. So important. Like, what's the context? What's our overall who are we, what's the sort of valence level of things that can be really helpful, also can be helpful in negotiations to get out of the weeds when people are stuck there. And then the curiosity that you definitely have, wanting to talk, wanting to learn new things from other people, that I found that quality to be really helpful, obviously with authenticity, but just wanting to experience new things and get to talk to really interesting people like you, and you have with your interviews and your outreach and all the environments that you're in too, can be a great way to learn and educate, and it's kind of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. I
It
appreciate it.
it's interesting that you mentioned you're an introvert too earlier,
Yeah.
um, and this has just been great. You really provided so many insights that people listening can, I'm sure, relate to, and then also they can put to use in their daily life and thinking about whether it's their next step in their career, or how they want to just kind of go through and interact with others. So thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Of course, this was super fun, and thank you so much for having me.
Listeners, thanks for being along for another episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks. And here is that update with Jessica Lee. Jessica, since we actually had a chance to talk initially, you made a really exciting transition from VC to a growth marketing to do growth marketing at Zagino, which for our listeners is a General Catalyst backed growth stage startup that's building the world's largest life sciences supplies marketplace. And I wonder if you could share with listeners a little bit about first, what you're doing at Zagino, what the company does, and a little bit maybe about why you decided to make the switch, the change.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me back on. Really appreciate the kind words. To give some more context on my transition. So, I know we had last spoken sort of around the end of the summer, and towards the beginning of the fall, I left VC. So, as listeners will know or recall, I was at Sonoma Capital, a seed stage fund. And then now, as of late September of 2020, joined Zagino, which, as you mentioned, is in the biotech life sciences space, which is essentially a B2B procurement marketplace for the life sciences. And so we're looking at Amazon for the life sciences, where lab managers, scientists, biotech startups, medical institutions, universities, research labs, pharma companies go to more easily and more seamlessly procure their lab equipment, materials, and supplies. We're actually the largest marketplace for lab equipment and supplies in the world. So it's super exciting to be a part of the journey. We're a few years old now, but the growth marketing function is relatively new. Actually founded, I guess you could say, in April of this year when my boss joined to senior director of growth marketing, and she's the first hire there. And so it's been great to work on different things like content marketing and social media partnerships with different incubators and VC funds, and supporting our sales team through training and creating really useful collateral, and also making sure our CRM is really robust in terms of company and contact discovery and coverage. And then also working with our design team to make sure our website and our blog and other kind of user or prospect facing materials are really optimized for conversion. And then also sort of doing a little bit of product work as well, less product manager work, but more product marketing. And so getting more in the weeds with our very interesting product as well. So it's been really great, really cross-functional, really creative, really collaborative, and have learned a ton in these few short months. Hard to believe it's only been a quarter, but it's been really awesome. The company is based in Boston. I actually founded in Berlin since the founders are from there, but then moved gradually towards Boston, just given obviously the richness of the life sciences ecosystem there. And so long term, I'll be based out there, although obviously we'll sort of see how COVID pans out, and also what the remote working world will be like. And I'm currently still back home in New Jersey, so remote onboarding has been a little bit anticlimactic, still like the same office space and I guess different computer, but looks the same. So sort of a different Zoom screen. So that's a little bit about my next step.
So cool. Really interesting role or part of the industry that it is leading. And I wonder here if you wrote this piece in Medium, and listeners, we're going to have a link to it in the show notes. It's just so insightful. It offers a lot of advice, talks about the VC industry and your transition, and really what you learned, what you felt that you really are bringing with you to Zagino from your experience in VC. Can you just give us a bit of a preview about that? And listeners, as I said, we'll have Jessica's complete article linked to in the show notes.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you so much for the kind words and the read there. It was really fun to be able to reflect on my time in BC and what I learned there, since it certainly was a lot and sort of transitioning into a very different world in growth marketing. Happy to talk about the differences that I found in operator versus VC land as well afterwards. But in terms of the article, so a couple kind of highlights. I think there's sort of three main buckets that I put the advice into, sort of just my own constructs. So feel free to interpret however you'd like, but some
Mhm.
highlights from each one. Obviously, there's quite a bit more in there that I'm covering right now for the sake of time. But a couple quick highlights that I think really jumped out at me, as well as other people. So I think first around sort of career journeys, I guess that's sort of a never-ending process for all of us, and also a very unique experience for everybody, since everybody has different preferences and different lifestyles and different strengths and weaknesses. And I think kind of one thing I learned even in the transition process to growth marketing, I was deciding between different job opportunities that were all in sort of different fields, primarily centered around the operator world, but different functions, different industries, different stages of companies. And people kept asking me, people who were trying to give me advice and helping to make this decision, they kept asking me, this is all great, the pros, cons you listed out in the descriptions, but what's your ultimate career goal? And I was a little bit stuck, since I still don't actually know that. And I'm sure all of us are
Sure.
not entirely certain about that. And so I was like, oh, maybe I'll just be a COO or something, because I'm pretty execution oriented and I
Mhm.
do kind of want to spend some more time in operator world. And they're like, okay, great. Well, here's which job would better lend itself towards that. But then I was sort of thinking, what if I think I want to be a COO, but I end up and I optimize every single decision for that, but then end up as a COO, which, is seemingly great, but then I end up realizing that I hate it, or it's not a
Mhm.
great fit for me. And that would have been very tragic to have, made all my big career decisions around something that I don't actually understand or want to do.
Mhm.
And so I think kind of a better way to think about it is, unless you have, you want to be a doctor and that's 100%, your goal, and you won't deviate from that, which is, true for some people, which is great. But for most people, I think they're a little bit more like me, with broad interests and broad goals and wanting to explore things, especially early on in their career. And so I think a better way to think about it is sort of seeing yourself as the product, sort of borrowing some VC and startup terminology, and discovering your product market fit. So even if this particular job that you do, it doesn't work out, or isn't the place that you spend the rest of your professional life at, which obviously will be the case for most jobs, you will have gotten something intentional out of it. And also
Mhm.
looking back, you will have created a very intentional collection of different skill sets. And so I think that's sort of a better way to look at it. So approaching each job or each sort of crossroads professionally, thinking about what skill set do I want to learn next, as well as what do I want to learn about myself, and having the skill set as well as the deepening understanding of yourself be sort of your guiding principles.
Mhm.
And just like product market fit, the next one probably won't hit the bullseye, and or at least may not, but then being able to at least gain some level of insight and some level of expertise from each experience in a very intentional, iterative way. And so thought that was really interesting around career growth.
Mhm.
The second bucket was sort of around learning and intentional learning. I think with VC, it really lends itself to that. I mean, every single conversation that you have with founders or other investors, you're constantly learning from each of the people you talk to, and even like reading articles or reading blog posts, like that's very much core to your job, not something that you have to do in secret on the weekends or in the evenings. And so that was really beautiful and really wonderful about VC. But I think it was also a little bit intimidating sometimes, since you're obviously talking to founders who have spent decades or at least many years, or much longer than you have at least, in a particular space. And so
Mhm.
how do you sort of ask them insightful questions? How do you help them? How do you evaluate them? And obviously, there is no kind of perfect answer, and I'm certainly still figuring that out myself, as I'm sure many VCs are. But I think
Mhm.
a really helpful way to think about it is that you're never really constrained, both in terms of your knowledge as well as your network, by what you come in with. One of my really great mentors in VC, he had this sort of, so basically, he had also gone into VC very early on and spent limited time in the operator world, which is sort of my situation back when I was in VC. And he said that, obviously when he came in, he had a very limited network, as people do at the very start of their careers. But then he sort of approached it with this true growth mindset. So essentially, he identified that design was going to be a really important function. For startups, this was sort of like 5 or so years ago. So it was a little bit contrarian, but obviously, as you've sort of seen, it has been very true. And so he realized that design help, both, in a more hands-on way, as well as being able to connect really great designers with startups, was going to be something that was super crucial. And so he made it his mission to meet every single, or at least the large majority or many people who were great designers in the New York ecosystem, which is where him and his startups operated primarily. And basically, even without having to leave his venture job at all, he was able to build this really rich network of designers and be able to help tons of his startups, both in and outside of his portfolio, hire for product designers and heads of design and chief product officers. So that was super cool to hear his story. And I sort of took a similar mentality towards learning as well as network building in VC. Like, sure, I came in with these assets. It's great to not forget them, but then also it's great to not be constrained by them and sort of see yourself sort of in that product market fit mindset as well, of like continuous learning and being able to learn about different spaces and not constrained by your current, product or market or otherwise circumstance. And so that was sort of on the intentional learning front. And the final bucket is sort of around network building. So I think before, when I was younger, I think for a lot of university students as well, they were sort of thinking a little bit more about this, and so I have others starting college later next year. But I think a lot of times university students, or just young people in general, have this concept that they are young, obviously, and that they are in this position to receive help or ask for help, but then they aren't really in a position to help others. And obviously, it's hard to argue with the fact that Bill Gates or whoever could probably help people more than myself or some random young person. But I think everybody has something to offer, and it's really important to kind of take that give first mentality to building relationships. So not like, I need a job at Goldman Sachs, so let me go look in my alumni directory to see who's worked at Goldman Sachs and give them a 30-minute call and hope they'll get me a job. But much more like this mentality of building just in case versus just in time relationships. Obviously, sometimes you might actually need something and there's going to be some last minute fire drills, but it's much better to be able to cultivate a relationship and be really supportive of the other person, just as a good person, as a good friend, as a good collaborator. And then maybe you need their help down the line, or maybe not. But either way, if you have a particular ask, you'll be able to request it from more of a place of trust and understanding and collaboration versus like a super transactional mentality. And so basically taking a more give first, taking a more long-term approach to relationship building and knowing how to keep relationships warm, even in between more synchronous conversations, was really helpful. And so learned that a lot, especially from my boss at Sonoma Capital, Anil, who does an incredible job of that. And so was able to learn a ton from him. So certainly the whole apprenticeship model of VC definitely holds true as well, since that was sort of his particular superpower. And I was able to borrow some of that as well, or learn a lot of what he does and adopt a lot of those good practices around relationship building. And so those are sort of 3 highlights from my broader article, but definitely recommend people take a read if they're interested.
Absolutely. And I just want to point out a few of the things that you said, Jessica, that really struck me. Obviously, I read the whole article, but just in the summary of the highlights that you mentioned that I think are particularly useful for me as I listen to what you're saying is, the one thing is the last thing you were talking about relationship building. One thing I say in my talks is, build relationships, don't just be a request. And it's hard, but I mean, that's easy to say. It's an easy line to just, put out there. But I find in my interactions with scientists, whether social scientists or natural scientists, that it can be hard to even know how to build a relationship or maintain one. Yeah, everyone can, find and send an email to someone in their alumni directory. But as you were, you hinted at, well, even people feel, what would I have to offer this other person who's been in the field for 20 years? But absolutely, you can find those things, and often it's so valuable because you have a completely different perspective than somebody who's been doing a job, being in industry for a long time, just by the fact that you are 20 years earlier in your career. And the other thing was, I really find that innovation just like is a word that's just like thrown around so much, it's almost like lost its meaning. But the way you described your approach to your career journey and the growth mindset, also the lessons and sort of taking certain things, approaches, both subject matter expertise, but also just, process, you start to see patterns, as you go further on in your career, regardless of industry. And, I've been fortunate to have folks on the show and we talk about this, where true innovation happens. And for me, my kind of overall thought, at least at this point, is a lot of it comes from piecing together very disparate things that to
Yeah.
you make sense because you've done, you've been in VC and now you're in growth marketing, and all the content marketing work and the interviewing you do and all these different things. But when you are confronted with something, you can stitch together ideas from all of those different experiences. That's something completely new that no one else would see, just because you have that kind of outlook.
Yeah. I totally agree. I love that point also around creativity as well. I think a lot of times people think that it's sort of this eureka moment that sort of happens in isolation coming out of nowhere. Maybe that happens sometimes, but I
Mhm.
think more often than not, it really is drawing these non-intuitive or non-obvious connections between different fields. And that
Mhm.
requires having experience and exposure, whether literally on the job or also just in sort of your independent learning and thinking, and requires a lot of time to be able to reflect on and intentionally digest the information that you're getting, both literally through kind of different content pieces you're reading or people you're talking to, but even just sort of subtle things that you might pick up on when you're watching people interact on the job or engage with each other or collaborate or resolve conflicts or negotiate. And so, really agree with you on that point as well.
Well, thanks for bringing this forward, both as this add on to the interview to share with us your exciting new role, and also the learnings that you provide in the interview itself, and also through the Medium post that will be, that will be linked to in the show notes, and all of the other sort of content that you're producing through your interviews and so forth. So, Jessica, it's been wonderful to have this follow up conversation with
Yeah.
you. Great to just talk and hear about your journey and your philosophy and your approach to it as someone who is really early in their career. I know it's going to be so valuable to listeners.
Thank you so much for having me on again. Really appreciate it. And it was great to speak with you again, as always.
Thank you. And listeners, thanks for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.